Welcome back. We shift focus to the top international story today. Protests are raging across China's zero-COVID policy, with demonstrators taking to the streets for the third straight day. Protests sparked after a fire broke out in a building that was under COVID restrictions and killed 10 people. Protesters were seen chanting slogans against Xi Jinping's and also demanding that he step down, while police dragged people away from the site. Chinese authorities have been monitoring social media for any news on the protests, with certain search terms being wiped away. China's zero-COVID policy gave the government the authority to place citizens under prolonged lockdowns, even if only a handful of cases were reported. As per latest data, China reported nearly 40,000 COVID cases for the fourth straight day, setting a new daily record high. Joining me now to take this forward is Ananth Krishnan, China correspondent at The Hindu, James Miles, China writer at large at The Economist. Thank you very much for joining us, James and Ananth. James, if I can come to you, give us a sense of the scale of these protests. How many districts, how many cities in China are these protests taking place?
China, I think the thing to focus on is the size of these cities and the political importance of them. The fact that protests have been taking place in Beijing, in Shanghai, and in several other major cities, Guangzhou, Chongqing, presents an even greater problem for the central government than if these were small remote towns scattered around the country. They have always been enormously sensitive to unrest that occurs in major urban areas, and particularly Beijing and Shanghai, and crucially, on university campuses. Several of these protests have taken place on university campuses in Beijing as well as in other cities. And you'll remember, of course, that the nationwide unrest that occurred in 1989, commonly called the Tiananmen Square protest, but in fact affecting all of China's major cities, that began on campuses as well. So this is being very closely watched for how it might develop in the coming days and whether we'll see similar sort of momentum.
Ananth, and I request James to continue being with us. Ananth, would this be a spontaneous protest? How well is it organized? Have we seen any kind of crackdown by the Chinese government?
Well, Parikshit, it certainly seemed very spontaneous to me here in Beijing last night, where I was at one of the gatherings where there were several hundred, mostly young people. There were people joining in even until past midnight last night, until there was a big police deployment at 2 a.m., which kind of made everybody disperse and go back. It seemed extremely spontaneous to me. And quite frankly, Parikshit, it's unprecedented, something I've never seen in China in the 10 plus years I've been living in Beijing. It's quite extraordinary to see this in the Chinese capital. And as James said, it's extremely politically significant for it to happen in Beijing of all places. And I think to me, it really showed that people are pretty much fed up. They're exhausted with living under these 3 years of zero COVID, of endless lockdowns, of the uncertainty they faced. Something I hear a lot, especially from students, is they feel they've had their youth stolen. They've been living in dormitories, extended periods of online learning, and many entering the worst job market possibly in China's reform era. So that's the sentiment and mood right now. And I think it's a very clear message that the zero COVID approach is quite unsustainable for the Communist Party, which at the same time has said even today on Monday they will continue with it. But I think they will be under pressure to at least announce some limited easing measures as far as lockdowns are concerned, because people have made it very, very clear that the economic costs, the social costs of this policy have really risen to such a high extent. There has been a huge security deployment, Parikshit, I think, to stimulate out a repeat of those protests in Beijing, both in the area where it happened, as well as in Tiananmen Square and in central parts of the city. And I think there will be, for sure, a crackdown in terms of them identifying people who've been spreading messages on social media and the like. And I think you can expect to see that as well, even though the government, I think, is really under pressure to at least signal to people that there's going to be some light at the end of this very dark tunnel.
Right. James, when you were speaking about Tiananmen Square incident, at that time, we didn't have social media acting the way it is today. almost everything that's happening in China is in some way or the other put out on social media. So do you feel the government will be careful in how it addresses the protesters, how it cracks down on them, whether it goes ahead to arrest some people? Do you think the government will be very careful in its approach and may actually reduce the intensity of these restrictions, of these COVID restrictions?
Well, you have to bear in mind that protests are actually relatively common in China. Small-scale, isolated protests by groups of people with various kinds of grievance usually against local government, the seizure of property for development, for example, land from farmers, that kind of thing. And the government it has actually been quite adept in controlling those kind of protests, allowing them to happen for a limited period of time, then perhaps later rounding up the ringleaders. And that's prevented this kind of unrest from ever sort of gaining a sort of joined upness that might threaten the central government in a more serious way. Social media certainly do complicate the picture for the government. Pictures of these protests have been circulating. Of course, censors have been stepping in very quickly to try to stop that. And I think they probably feel that on balance, when in a crisis like this, they feel that social media or the spread of information they dislike on social media can be controlled. But it is very difficult, and people do find ways around censors' controls by publishing items that that avoid certain keywords that censors are trying to block, and so on. And so I think this is going to be quite a sort of cat and mouse game. And there's a particular risk, I think, involved in these protests in that they've gone beyond demand simply for an end to the zero COVID policy. There is a very strong political tinge, at least to some of the protests we've seen. In Shanghai, protesters saying down with the Communist Party, down with Xi Jinping. Even in 1989, you have to bear in mind, and I was there, I didn't hear protesters saying down with the Communist Party. So this takes it to a level, I think, that the government is going to be extremely nervous about.
Right. Those are very important points, James. Ananth, to what extent is the economic slowdown in China, which to a large extent can be attributed to the zero COVID strategy, the intensive lockdowns, how much of that is driving these protests right now?
I think that certainly is a part of it, but not obviously the entire picture. I think that there have been a number of, speaking to some of the people out in Beijing yesterday, there was a lot of frustration in terms of the way lockdowns have been enforced. There's a lot of talk about people who've died in lockdowns, whether it was young children or most recently the 10 people who died in Urumqi in an apartment fire. So I think it was a real sense of frustration at the general direction in which things are moving. And I think that for many of them as well, it's gone beyond the enforcement of lockdowns to the politics that's underpinning it. There were people calling for freedom. There were even people calling for a free press. So it has sort of morphed into these wider concerns for people. But I think economically as well, that is a huge factor underpinning it. To me, Parikshit, it seems that the sentiment here is far more depressed than I've seen even during the worst days of the financial crisis. And zero COVID is terrible for small businesses. The unpredictability of knowing that you might be, closed up tomorrow. It's extremely difficult for people to hire, and especially for college graduates. I think it's no accident why so many of people taking to the streets have been young, is that they're really facing such a dire job market when they graduate. So I think it's really sort of a combination of factors that's driven things to where they are right now.
Right. And James, very quickly, we've run out of time. You said that protests against the Communist Party are unprecedented. How unprecedented would be to demand the resignation or asking Xi Jinping to step down? Has that been heard before, or probably this is the first time? Are you seeing protests of this kind?
Well, certainly involving, significant numbers of people out on a major road in a major city. Yes, we saw a brief one-man protest just before the recent Communist Party Congress in Beijing. Banners put up on a bridge calling for the resignation of Xi Jinping. But for people to do that on the street, that's extraordinarily daring. And even though we've only sort of seen it in this concentrated way in Shanghai so far, I think that will raise eyebrows and cause some concern. And you have to bear in mind that when protests become more directly focused on an individual leader in this way, and we saw this in '89, we've seen it in earlier protest movements in China, that's when the authorities start cracking down very hard.
All right, we've run out of time, but James Miles, Ananth, Krishnan, thank you very much for joining us on these unprecedented protests that we're looking at different cities in China over the zero-COVID strategy. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Newscentre. Thank you for watching. News continues on the other side.